There's a layer beneath our feet that nobody wants to talk about, a stratum of mud, compressed earth and buried architecture that exists in almost every city on this planet. Not ancient ruins from thousands of years ago. Recent buildings, structures from the 1700s and 1800s buried under 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet of soil that appeared seemingly overnight. The official explanation involves landfill, street-raising projects, gradual sediment accumulation, reasonable answers that fall apart the moment you start measuring. I'm talking about basement windows at ground level, doors that open into dirt, first floors that became basements without any documented excavation. And it's everywhere. Seattle, Savannah, Rome, Istanbul, San Francisco. Cities separated by oceans, by cultures, by centuries of supposed independent development. All sharing the same impossible feature, a buried ground floor. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Walk through the old district of almost any major city and you'll find it. Staircases descending to what were clearly main entrances. Windows half submerged in sidewalks. Buildings where the architectural proportions only make sense if you account for 12 feet of missing height. We're told these anomalies resulted from urban planning, from efforts to combat flooding, from the natural accumulation of debris over time. But here's what that explanation requires you to believe: that cities across the world, with no communication, no shared planning committees, no coordinating authority, all independently decided to bury their existing street level under massive amounts of earth within the same narrow time window. That they did this without displacing populations, without decades of documented construction, without the logistical nightmare that raising an entire city's elevation would necessarily entail. That the before and after photographs we do have somehow failed to capture any of this monumental undertaking in progress. The timeline doesn't work, the coordination doesn't work, the silence doesn't work. So what does work? What explanation accounts for a global layer of mud appearing rapidly enough that buildings were buried rather than demolished, that populations adapted rather than relocated, that the historical record treats as mundane rather than catastrophic? I need to take you back to something that appears in geology textbooks as settled science. The concept of uniformitarianism, the idea that geological processes occur gradually, steadily, at rates we can observe and measure today. Mountains rise slowly, canyons erode over millennia. Sediment accumulates in predictable layers across vast stretches of time. This principle has governed geological thinking for nearly 2 centuries, and it's not entirely wrong, but it's not entirely complete either. Because there's another principle, one that fell out of favour in academia, but never disappeared from the evidence. Catastrophism. The idea that sudden, violent, civilization-altering events have shaped Earth's surface more dramatically than slow processes ever could. Floods that remake coastlines in hours. Earthquakes that swallow cities. Atmospheric events that bury landscapes under meters of displaced material. The mud layer suggests catastrophism. Specifically, it suggests water. A lot of water, moving fast, carrying sediment, debris and organic material, then depositing it uniformly across vast areas as the waters receded. Not a gentle rising of sea level, not a slow accumulation of dust and dirt. A flood. Rapid, overwhelming, recent enough that the buildings it buried were still standing, still inhabited, still structurally sound enough to be adapted rather than abandoned. Now I know what you're thinking. Floods leave evidence. They leave geological markers, sediment patterns, documented historical accounts. And you're right. They do. Which is why it's strange that the mud layer, this global phenomenon affecting cities from Boston to Bombay, is never discussed in those terms. Never investigated as a unified event. Never questioned as anything other than ordinary urban development. Unless it was questioned. Unless there were accounts, unless the evidence exists but has been carefully reclassified, reinterpreted, or quietly ignored. Let me show you what I mean. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers regularly reported discoveries of buried structures during construction projects. Not ancient ruins, recent buildings, sometimes with artifacts inside suggesting sudden abandonment, sometimes with architectural features indicating they were built for a street level that no longer existed. These articles treat the discoveries as curiosities, oddities, interesting footnotes. They never ask the larger question. They never connect the pattern. But someone was connecting it. Because around the same time these discoveries were being made, something else was happening in the academic world. The study of catastrophism was being actively suppressed. Researchers who suggested rapid geological change were marginalized. Theories involving recent floods were dismissed as unscientific, religiously motivated, incompatible with the uniformitarian framework that had become dogma. The timing is remarkable. Just as physical evidence of a recent catastrophic flood was emerging from beneath cities worldwide, the academic apparatus that might investigate such an event was being dismantled. Not through debate or evidence, but through institutional pressure and narrative control. What were they protecting? Not the evidence itself. The mud layer isn't hidden. The buried buildings aren't secret. You can see them, photograph them, measure them. What's hidden is the framework, the context that would allow someone to look at a basement window at street level in Chicago and connect it to a similar window in Paris and ask the question nobody's supposed to ask. What if these weren't separate urban development projects? What if this wasn't gradual accumulation? What if something happened? Something global, something recent enough that we should have records, accounts, explanations, something that buried the ground floor of civilization under a layer of mud and sediment, then was systematically written out of history as anything other than ordinary, expected, completely normal urban evolution. The evidence for that event is still here. It's beneath your feet right now, depending on where you're standing. But to see it clearly, to understand what it means, we need to follow the water backward. We need to find where it came from. Which brings us back to 1816, the year without a summer. The year the official story tells us Mount Tambora erupted in Indonesia, ejecting ash into the atmosphere, cooling the planet, destroying harvests. A volcanic winter. Natural, explicable, contained, except Tambora doesn't explain the mud. Volcanic ash settles differently than water-deposited sediment. It creates distinct layers. It contains specific mineral signatures. It shows up in ice core samples in predictable patterns. The mud layer beneath our cities? Different composition, different distribution, different everything. So if not volcanic ash, what? Here's where the timeline gets uncomfortable. Because 1816 isn't just the year without a summer, it's also when something else happened. Something that doesn't appear in textbooks but shows up repeatedly in primary sources if you know where to look. Reports of unprecedented flooding, not regional, global. From Europe to Asia to the Americas, waters rising, rivers overflowing their banks with no apparent source, coastal areas inundated, and then, just as suddenly, receding, leaving behind precisely what you'd expect from catastrophic flood recession, a layer of mud. I found an account from Switzerland, a farmer describing water appearing overnight, covering fields that had been dry the previous evening. Not rain. The sky was clear, just water rising from somewhere, covering everything, then draining away over the following weeks. His fields were buried under 2 feet of silt. Similar accounts from Bavaria, from the Russian steppes, from regions of China, all describing the same pattern. Sudden water. No clear source, rapid recession, thick mud deposits left behind. These aren't tsunami accounts. Tsunamis don't work this way. They strike coastlines. These reports come from inland areas, from locations hundreds of miles from any ocean. The water came from somewhere else. But here's the problem. If you're trying to explain a global flood event in 1816, you need a mechanism. You need a source for that much water. You need physics that work. And the official record provides nothing, which is why most people, when they encounter these accounts, dismiss them as exaggeration, local flooding, blown out of proportion, the kind of regional disaster that feels apocalyptic to those experiencing it, but doesn't represent anything truly global. Except the mud layer is global, the buried buildings are global, the timing is global. So either we're looking at the most remarkable coincidence in human history, dozens of unrelated local floods all happening in the same year, all depositing similar sediment layers, all burying structures at similar depths, or we're looking at one event, one source, one explanation that's been carefully kept out of the mainstream narrative. I'm going to propose something, and I want you to understand I'm not stating this as fact. I'm presenting it as a pattern that fits the evidence better than the official story. What if the water came from above? Not rain, not precipitation in any conventional sense, but a release of atmospheric water on a scale we're not supposed to believe is possible. There's a concept in alternative research circles called the vapor canopy theory, the idea that Earth once had a layer of water vapor in the upper atmosphere, creating a greenhouse effect, moderating temperatures, increasing atmospheric pressure, fundamentally altering the environment. And that at some point, catastrophically, that canopy collapsed all at once. 40 days and 40 nights if you want the biblical version. But here's what makes this relevant. If such a collapse happened, even partially, even in a limited modern form, the results would be exactly what we see in the historical record. Sudden global flooding from atmospheric water release, rapid temperature drops as the moderating vapor layer dissipated, crop failures from the sudden climate shift. And when the waters receded, a uniform layer of mud and sediment covering everything that had been at ground level. Now I know the immediate objection. There's no vapor canopy now. We've mapped the atmosphere. We understand its composition. There's no massive water layer waiting to collapse. You're right, there isn't. Not anymore. But what if there was in 1816? What if what we call the year without a summer wasn't volcanic winter, but the atmospheric aftermath of a partial canopy collapse? The cooling wasn't from ash blocking the sun. It was from the sudden loss of the greenhouse effect that vapor layer provided. The weird weather patterns weren't volcanic disruption. They were the atmosphere restabilizing after losing a fundamental component of its structure. And the mud, the buried buildings, the global flood accounts that never made it into official history. Those were the physical evidence of what happens when you drop that much atmospheric water onto the surface all at once. I can't prove this. Not with the evidence available to us. The data has been filtered through too many institutional layers, reinterpreted through too many academic frameworks designed specifically to make this kind of catastrophism impossible to discuss seriously. But I can show you the pattern. I can point to the mud layer, to the buried buildings, to the flood accounts, to the climate disruption, to the timing that places all of this in the same narrow window. And I can ask the question that nobody in authority seems willing to address. If this was just volcanic ash and normal urban development, why does the evidence look so much like something else? Why does it look like drowning? The implications of this go further than you might think. Because if there was a flood event in 1816, if that's what buried the first floors of our cities, then we need to ask what those cities looked like before the flood. We need to ask who built them. And that question leads us directly back to the architecture problem we've been circling this entire series. Those classical buildings, those impossible construction timelines, that global uniformity of style. What if they weren't being built during the 1800s? What if they were already there, buried to their second stories in mud, waiting to be excavated and claimed by whoever survived? That changes everything about how we understand the 19th century. Not as a period of explosive growth and rapid construction, but as a period of recovery and reoccupation. The survivors didn't build those buildings, they dug them out. Think about what that would require. Coordinated excavation efforts across multiple continents. A unified narrative to explain why these structures appeared to be new construction when they were actually archaeological recovery. Control over the historical record tight enough to prevent the real story from spreading. That level of coordination doesn't happen accidentally. Which means someone knew. Someone understood what had happened and made a deliberate choice about how to frame it for future generations. Now I want to address something directly. The resistance to this idea doesn't come from lack of evidence. It comes from the implications. Because if we accept that a global flood event happened in 1816, we have to accept that our entire understanding of recent history is built on a false foundation. The Industrial Revolution wasn't about innovation, it was about rediscovery. The westward expansion wasn't about conquering wilderness, it was about occupying emptied cities. The colonial empires weren't spreading civilization. They were claiming the remnants of one that had already existed. Every national origin story falls apart. Every founding myth dissolves. Every carefully constructed timeline of progress and development becomes a cover for something much stranger. Inheritance masquerading as achievement. And here's where it connects back to Tartaria, because those maps that show a vast civilization across Central Asia, those architectural similarities that span continents, those construction techniques that appear fully formed without evolutionary development, they all make sense if we're looking at a pre-flood civilization. One that existed globally before 1816, a one that built on a scale and with a uniformity that seems impossible to us now, because we're looking at it through the lens of post-flood fragmentation. The flood didn't just bury buildings, it broke continuity. It severed the connection between the people who survived and the civilization they inherited. Maybe that's why the historical record goes silent in the early 1800s. Maybe that's why construction documentation doesn't exist for these structures. Maybe that's why the official narrative requires us to believe in miraculous building timelines and unexplained architectural coordination. Because documenting recovery is harder than claiming creation. Admitting inheritance is more complicated than declaring achievement. The truth would require explaining where the original civilization went, how the flood happened, why the survivors chose to obscure rather than acknowledge what they found. Those are questions without comfortable answers. So, what actually happened in 1816? I think we're looking at the terminal moment of a global reset. A catastrophic atmospheric event, possibly the collapse of a vapor canopy, possibly something else we don't have framework to understand yet. The immediate result was climate chaos. The year without a summer, crop failures, famine, population displacement on a scale that emptied cities. The secondary result was flooding, not gradual sea level rise, not localized river overflow, a deluge that left a uniform mud layer across inhabited areas worldwide. That mud buried the ground floors of existing structures, preserved them, and created the archaeological puzzle we're still uncovering today. The tertiary result was the inheritance period. The survivors, whether they were remnants of the pre-flood population or newcomers moving into emptied territories, excavated what they could, claimed what they found, and created new narratives to explain their sudden possession of advanced infrastructure. By 1850, the story had solidified. These buildings were ours. We built them. The previous civilization, if it was acknowledged at all, became Tartaria, a vague historical curiosity, a cartographic term, nothing important, nothing worth investigating. But the evidence remained. In the buried windows, in the basement levels that were clearly ground floors, in the flood accounts that never made it into textbooks, in the architectural uniformity that transcends supposed cultural boundaries, in the construction timelines that don't work, in the gaps in the historical record that appear exactly when they shouldn't. The mud doesn't lie. Architecture doesn't lie. The physical evidence is still here, still visible, still waiting for someone to look at it without the filter of official explanation. What I'm suggesting isn't that we've been deliberately deceived by some coordinated conspiracy. I think the truth is stranger and more organic than that. I think the survivors genuinely didn't understand what they'd inherited. I think they created explanations that made sense within their limited framework. And I think those explanations calcified into academic consensus before anyone thought to question them seriously. By the time we had the technology to investigate properly, the narrative was already set. The buried buildings were basements, the mud layer was development fill, the flood accounts were exaggeration, the architectural similarities were coincidence, the missing construction records were lost to time. Every anomaly had an explanation, every question had an answer, and anyone who pushed further was dismissed. But here's what they can't explain away. The mud is real. The buried structures are real. The timing is real. The global pattern is real. And the silence, the institutional refusal to investigate, to excavate, to ask the obvious questions, that's real too. Something happened in 1816. Something that buried our cities, disrupted our climate, and severed our connection to whoever came before. The evidence is still here, literally beneath our feet, under every major city, under every historical downtown, under every structure that predates the mid-1800s. There's another layer, another story. And we've been walking over it our entire lives, never thinking to look down. The flood happened. The mud rose. The old world drowned. And when the waters receded, we inherited what remained and called it progress. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm showing you what they're not explaining. The mud layer exists. The buried buildings exist. The flood accounts exist. The atmospheric event of 1816 exists. The architectural inheritance exists. The gaps in documentation exist. The institutional silence exists. You can accept the official story. Volcanic ash, urban development, gradual accumulation, separate, unrelated coincidences happening simultaneously across the globe. Or you can look at what's actually in front of you and ask why it all points in the same direction. Something ended in 1816. Something began after. And everything we've been told about that transition requires us to ignore the physical evidence of what's still buried under our streets. The buildings are waiting. The mud remembers. And somewhere in the space between what we're told and what we can see, there's a history we weren't supposed to find. Now you know where to look.